I think that you will all agree that without help of international financial institutions and donors, Ukraine would struggle to come out of such a severe economic crisis and to accomplish progress with reform implementation. So economic activity is picking up, inflation went down, gross international reserves have risen, and the exchange rate has been relatively stable. But this is not enough. So what shall be done to achieve long-awaited economic breakthrough by our country? This is the question that we will ask the members of our first panel discussion, but this is also the question that we would like to ask you. At the registration you were provided with the small voting devices. I hope you all have them. You can use them now to answer the first question, what shall be done for Ukraine to achieve the long-awaited breakthrough. Please, I would like to ask to show the question on the screen now. Yes, I would like to ask the audience to unpack the devices and to use them. So here is the question. The proposed answers, so you are asked to choose one of the answers. The proposed answers are favorable export commodity markets, recovered confidence in the banking system, B, and resumed lending, C, combating corruption and fair court system, and D, foreign direct investments. I thought the audience would struggle with choosing because we probably need all four, but I think you can already see the winner. Yeah. Thank you. The time is out, so we see the clear answer to the question. Combating corruption and fair court system. Now let's see if you will change your mind after listening to the discussion of our first panel. And I'm pleased to invite to present the moderator of the first panel discussion, Managing Director and the Head of Research at Dragon Capital, Andriy Bespyatov.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to invite our first panelist to the floor, please, and we will start. It's my pleasure to moderate such a strong panel with such honored guests and panelists. Let me introduce all of them from my left to the right. First, Yulia Kovalev. She is the first Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine, and she is the chairperson of the Supervisory Board of Ukraine. And for the last almost year and a half, she is helping to reform a number of issues. Is the natural gas market, state-owned enterprises, privatization, and other things. And as we know, she is a person with the last two governments who is trying to push the reforms in certain particular areas, and we see the progress in those areas. We have Oleg Chuli, Deputy Governor of NBU and the senior banker with over 20 years of experience in the sector. We have Daniela Bilek, who is currently the director of the newly created Ukrainian investment promotion office, and the person with over 25 years experience. And before this new position, he was managing partner in Kyiv office of the global law firm CMS Cameron McKenna, and the person who advised a number of governments and dealt in a number of sectors. So it's an honor that we have here today. We have Rafat Mardanov, Director for Ukraine and Belarus in International Financial Corporation, one of the largest investors of this country, de facto, and the organization that invested several $1 billion, I guess, in Ukraine for the last 20 years, I think. And the last but not the least, Farhan is a lead economist in the World Bank, and currently the program leader in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the person who before Ukraine traveled a lot in so many countries, some of them maybe even more interesting and challenging than Ukraine, as we discussed. It's Afghanistan, and we had Albania and Asian countries, so I think we have a very powerful panel. And we start very briefly as we planned. I want to really briefly ask, do you agree with the results of the poll? Have you voted the same way, with whatever, three-fourths of voting going to fighting with corruption and improving the judicial system in Ukraine? Yulia, what?
My answer was quite a big difference. It was number 2. But I think that these questions are not, just acceptable. So all of them together, because if we're talking about for example, the FDI, which was my answer, we understand that one of the biggest bottlenecks for increasing the FDIs and making a good business climate inside the country is really the judicial reform. Because one of the highest risk for any of the investors here in Ukraine is the risk of our court system, is the risk to be taken out of their asset, taking out the money they've invested in Ukraine because of unfair legal decisions. And then as a consequence, why these legal decisions could appear, it's because of corruption. So these questions are not, some of the different parts of it. So they all together put the thing that we are very theoretically calling the business climate. But this business climate really contains of several things that should be fixed up in the country. And if you ask me personally, what is the biggest thing to do and where we should put one of the most of our efforts is of course the judicial reform.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you agree with your colleague?
Basically, I voted for court system, and I think all other items which were mentioned in this way actually derivatives from the court system. Means if we have reform of the court system, we might have increase of FDI, we might have increase of banking lending, which is very crucial, and we always asked by a lot of people, why actually you are not promoting lending? But there is a limitation for central bank. We can secure macroeconomic stabilization, we can secure financial stability, but unfortunately we can't force banks to provide loans because there is a high risk that they will not be able to return their money back. And this is again a question of court system. I think court system is a foundation. And only after we have this foundation, we can count for further development of the country. It's very crucial.
Okay. As a person who will promote investment in the country, then do you think those 4 things can help us a lot?
You should have had an E, all of the above. I think that would have probably won the day. I mean, it's kind of a penetrating glimpse into the obvious, really, and I support what the previous 2 panelists have said. I think that, we have to have some perspective on this. The fundamental problem in this country when you talk to investors is the flexible application of the rule of law in the courts and the enormous power that law enforcement agencies have. And the impact that they have on investors. It's outsized to anything that goes on in any other civilized country. But I think, we can talk about, we need to do. I think we need to also understand how we need to do it. And that requires an understanding that Ukraine is going through a fundamental transformation. This is not Romania or Bulgaria that has a corruption problem. We don't have the institutions in this country yet that other democracies have in order to build these and protect the rights of investors and citizens. We're still building them. We've never had them in Ukraine. We've always been somebody else's national institutions. And this is why the European integration process, this is why the IMF program, this is why the EU association agreement are so fundamentally important, because they build the rules and procedures and provide the predictability and certainty that business needs and wants in order to invest. And so we're in this transformation period. We really started building this country 2 years ago. And if you look at what's been done with you've had people like Yulia and her team in the Ministry of Economy, that never happened before. I spent 10 years inside the Ukrainian government, advising the Minister of Justice and the Prime Ministers and the passport. I was all alone. I was the only foreigner there. And there were nobody who could speak English. And now you have these young Ukrainians who have come in, and that gives me a lot of hope. The system is transforming. It needs to transform faster. And the only way it will transfer faster is for civil society, including professional associations such as yours, to keep the pressure on. We're winning. We just have to keep the pressure on.
Okay, thank you very much. I will move to the second question. Frankly, I initially didn't want to ask about, but everyone is now talking about global uncertainty, especially after the previous week elections in the United States and ongoing situation in Europe. But Ukraine is maybe a little bit more isolated, and maybe it's not that important for Ukraine. So, Faruk, based on your global experience, do you think that the things like the elections in the United States, upcoming elections in Europe, like France, Germany, and some other issues we all know in Europe, do you think it's quite crucial for Ukraine? Or pretty much we have our own agenda? And if yes, when do you think we'll see that it's being influencing our country?
Yeah, I think the external conditions that you speak about are extremely important, and beyond those external conditions, there has been a sea change in the global environment that faces Ukraine today compared to the global environment that faced Ukraine over the last 15 years. As Satu mentioned in her opening remarks, for much of the last 15 years, Ukraine really faced extremely favorable external conditions. Booming global commodity markets, free flow of capital to emerging markets. All of that began to change when Lehman Brothers hit in 2008. The flow of capital to emerging markets became much more difficult. Ukraine entered a period of economic stagnation. And then, of course, in 2013, the double whammy of both the conflict in Ukraine and the decline in commodity prices hit Ukraine very sharply. Now, beyond those fundamental shifts in the tectonic plates that are the foundation of Ukraine's economy, beyond those fundamental shifts, there are, of course, the increasing global uncertainties that we face today. Brexit, many would say the changing political landscape in the United States, all of which has serious global drivers. There has been a stagnation of real wages of unskilled workers in the industrialized world for much of the last 30 years. People are unhappy with the status quo. They are voting with their feet, they're voting for change, regardless of whether that change is good or bad. So I think we will see increasing uncertainties in the global economy, which will have implications for Ukraine. What all of this means is that Ukraine needs to do even more than what it would have needed to do if it faced the same conditions that it faced over the last 15 years. We know that much has been done in Ukraine in the last 3 years, since Maidan. Probably more has been done in the last 3 years than what has been done in the last 20 years to put things right in this economy. But when we look at the growth rate today, for the last 3 quarters, it's still 1.1%. Why? It's because Ukraine needs to do even more. Because of the uncertain global environment that it faces today, it needs to do even more to fix the fundamental bottlenecks that characterize this economy.
Thank you very much. Daniel, based on your experience of advising governments in this region, what would you advise, given this global current uncertainty, for Ukrainian government, for Ukrainian society?
I think that government needs, and I think the Prime Minister certainly understands that attracting investment is a matter of national security. This is now not just about let's open up our market and let's try to bring some people in. I mean, if we do not stimulate foreign direct investment in Ukraine, we have nowhere else to get this money. We cannot be on the lifeline of the IMF and I hate the word donors because it means we're hand in hand, some sort of a life support system. I think that really what you will see happening, and one of the reasons I took this position was I saw in my own practice that a large part of the story of reform was not getting told. People say there's no reforms, there's no reforms, there's no reforms. There is. What you've seen for the first time, actually, and I've been here 25 years, is a continuity. The previous government, as much as people criticized it, but there were some really star-studded reformers, they did a lot to get the ball rolling. This government is now implementing those reforms. It may not be as sexy, it may not be as high profile. That's part of the problem, is getting the message out. But that process is continuing. You're seeing a process, a continuum that's taking place, especially in the area of deregulation. Every week we have a meeting with the Prime Minister and key ministers and agencies on what needs to be further deregulated. And I think you'll see that starting at each cabinet meeting, another initiative to reduce the number of, really drilling down. You know, you've got to make people want to come to this country, so you make it easy for them. You start drilling down and getting rid of a lot of these regulations that we have. We actually have some fantastic news. The World Bank's regulatory governance statistics report came out last week, and Ukraine was equal to Germany over the past 2 years, 5.2 out of 6. In terms of new regulations that are being implemented, the regulatory impact assessments that go on, the amount of input from the public that goes into this process. The problem is we have this whole corpus of post-Soviet and Soviet era regulation that needs to be wiped out, including many of the agencies and things like that. But institutionally, these things take time, but we don't have time. And we need a change in mentality. I like the title of this session and this conference, because it really is incumbent upon government ministers to understand that Ukraine is not the bride. There's not a lineup of 100 companies waiting to put $100 million into this economy. We have to treat investors as we would guests in our own home. We've got to set the table, we've got to clean the house, we've got to put up the crystal, the best dishes, and really make them feel like, wow, this is the greatest place to be, even though there are problems.
Okay, thank you very much. We very smoothly move to the next question on the reforms that have been done and what should be done. And as Satu said, and it's pretty much everyone is talking about that Ukraine for the last 25 years. Currently we are probably the lowest by GDP per capita country in the region. So if we take Europe. But what are the reforms? Well, pretty much we know what was done. What do you think should be done in terms of reforms, or what are the upcoming reforms that we are looking for? May I ask you, please?
Of course, as already mentioned, that for the last two and a half years, a huge thing that were done inside the country, and many of those reforms are really painful. for our citizens, the reforms that National Bank have done with the floating exchange rate, with the cleaning up the banking system, because sometimes we see today, even in Kiev, protests are, which more or less, we guess, somehow managed, but still the energy prices is also a very big challenge for the government currently from the political perspective, because everywhere worldwide increasing tariffs, it's not a popular reform. Even with a country's 10 times GDP more than Ukraine, still the people will be criticizing such decisions of the government. But look on this particular decision. It's not only about the tariffs, it's not only about the budget deficit, it's not only about our reserves, it's about the big stimulus that the economy will finally got for 25 years. It's the stimulus for energy efficiency. Because if we compare Ukraine, for example, to Germany, we are consuming 3 times more energy resources per $1 of GDP than Germany does. And how we can talk, and for 20 years we talked about the energy efficiency, we were trying to implement with the help of UNIFIs a lot of projects. But if you have no real rate of return for these projects, if these prices, there was a bill for the heating less than the price for a pocket of the cigarette. So what were the stimulus to put the money into energy efficiency? What were the stimulus to make our economy more efficient in terms of energy resources? And really only this reform will open us around $35 billion of US new market of energy efficiency for the next 10 years. And it's also a possibility to get the investment there. When we started this discussion and you've done this review of what are the bottlenecks for the driving of the economy, and more than 75% we're talking about the corruption. But let's see what are the sources of corruption, where this corruption rise. To my mind, first of all, it's about all of the public services. And that's why the regulation is one of the priority, and we are putting every month on the table a new deregulation, because the less business and the less the citizens will interact with any of the public authorities, the less even the possibility and the risk of this corruption could occur. And both with the deregulation, the implementation of the electronic services could also help to tackle this corruption. And now the second issue is our state-owned companies, because still we have more than 40% of our GDP in the state sector, in the public sector. And our state-owned companies, even for example, if we look for top 100 SEs out of 3,500 of SEs, it's around 92% of all the state assets, the state-owned. Of course, with untransparency of these companies, with political appointees at the management of these companies, we can talk here about anti-corruption issues, about the electronic declaration and whatever, still having such a big carrot of getting this black money out of the economy, we will never tackle the corruption. So that's why the reform of the biggest strategic SEs and the privatization of all of the others is the only way out to deal with this second big pillar of the corruption. And the third one is, of course, the judicial reform. Because if you finally are able to get the fair decision of the court, even if your rights somehow were, there was a mistreatment from the government, from any of the authority, or from your private partner, if you can go to the court and finally got a fair decision, your rights, just the basis of any of the business is the protection of your ownership right will be protected finally. You will still believe in this country. And here in the courts, there is the third biggest corruption. And that's why this year we made these amendments to the Constitution starting this reform. I'm not a naive, and we do not believe in that this reform will be done in several months. It will take us from 2 or 3 years, just the optimistic view, to change the judiciary system. And finally, we are getting to the fourth big pillar of making our country successful. It's all about the people. Because we can talk here about the changes need to be done, the political will, there are some theory. But when you finally got into the cabinet in the government, it's all about the people who are doing the things. And you need smart people to have in the public sector. You need young people with the values we share here. I hope everybody is sharing the values that we need to fix this country. And the more people you are able to get to the government to make this reform happen. Because there is a big, I will just from the practice say that there is a big difference of sitting and creating ideas and the real implementation of these ideas into not only the government laws and regulations, but just explaining people from the up to very down in the regions, how these new procedures, what are the regulation, how do they need to change the treatments to any of the business that Daniel said. Because the state finally is the service, and we need to make this service of high quality. That's why we have now a really big challenge to get qualified people to change this country, to get qualified people on board to the government, to our reform teams, to help to, not only to talk about the reforms, but to do reforms, which is, I would say, very crucial and very urgent for this country.
From the viewpoint of the World Bank, would you agree or would you add, because usually you have a reform agenda in pretty much all countries that you're present, so what would you probably add here?
Yeah, I would mostly agree. I think there are three important buckets of reforms that are important in Ukraine. If we look at the growth record of Ukraine, then for an extended period of time, Ukraine has really grown in fits and starts. We have seen periods of rapid economic growth, but then we have also seen periods of slump and contraction. This is in contrast to other countries that are able to generate strong and sustainable economic growth over an extended period of time. And then we ask, why is that the case? And we think that there are two important bottlenecks that characterize the unstable growth pattern of Ukraine for an extended period of time. The first is macroeconomic imbalances and macroeconomic instability. Ukraine has done a lot over the last 2 years to reduce macroeconomic imbalances. The overall fiscal deficit was reduced from 10% of GDP to 2% of GDP in 2015, from 2014 to 2015. But there are serious pressures that could cause the fiscal deficit to grow going forward. And the two main sources of pressures that we see going forward come from the pension system. Currently, Ukraine spends about 1/3 of all public expenditures on paying pension benefits. This means that there's just so little space to invest in more efficient public services, to invest in infrastructure, and so forth. And the pension system also does a very poor service of delivering, also does a very poor job of delivering effective protection for the elderly. Many of the elderly receive less than $2 a day. So there's a serious problem with the pension system that needs to be addressed, and that would reduce macroeconomic vulnerabilities going forward. The tax system is also characterized by very weak tax administration. The tax base remains narrow, so that is also an important area of reform going forward. The third source of macroeconomic imbalances is, of course, the financial sector. Most of you here will know that the banking sector in Ukraine has been characterized by large amounts of related party lending over an extended period of time. Many banks essentially borrow from the population to lend to themselves. Again, much has been done over the last 2 years to address this problem. From out of 180 plus banks, more than 80 banks have been closed so far, but there's a process that's still underway that still needs to be completed to resolve and recapitalize weak banks, to strengthen banking sector supervision, and also to strengthen the governance of state-owned banks and reduce the large volume of non-performing loans, so that the banking sector will not only not compromise macroeconomic stability, but will also serve as a source of lending for the private sector. That hasn't yet happened, and that needs to happen in order for economic growth to get going again. The second bucket of reforms that we see are important is the competitiveness of the private sector. For a long period of time, the private sector in Ukraine has been dominated by a small number of very large players, a highly concentrated, what many would call an oligarchical production structure. If you compare Ukraine's export structure with the export structure in many other countries in the region, we see an export structure in Ukraine that has been stagnant over time. Whereas if you look at the export structure in Poland, Slovakia, some of the Baltic countries, we see an export structure that is getting more sophisticated and more diversified over time. In order to move from what Ukraine has today to a more sophisticated export structure, a more productive private sector, it needs to create a level playing field for the private sector, where new Ukrainian enterprises can stimulate productivity and competitiveness of the private sector. The third bucket of reforms that we think is equally important is providing more effective services. Right now, people in Ukraine are hurting. Poverty is up from 15% in 2013 to 22% in 2015 because of the economic crisis. Many people have experienced a loss in their wages. Energy prices are of course up, although that has been mitigated to some extent by the new housing utility subsidy that has been put in place. But Ukraine still spends a large amount in providing education and health services, providing social assistance, but it does a very poor job of delivering quality services. There is a lot that can be done to improve the effectiveness of public services that would result in tangible improvements in the quality of life for the population. And the final reform area that we think is very important is, of course, anti-corruption. If we look at Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, the writing is very clear on the wall. The levels of corruption in Ukraine are closer to the poorest countries in the world than they are to the levels of corruption in the European Union that Ukraine wants to join. So that, of course, needs to change. And for that, one of the questions that you saw on the list over there was improving the justice system, anti-corruption measures. So that, I think, is a very important area of reform. But I think in order to really make progress on the entire reform agenda on anti-corruption, there probably should have been another point on that list, which is the voice of the Ukrainian people. I think what has driven a lot of the change since Maidan is that the people of Ukraine have been energized and engaged in pushing for change. They're no longer willing to take the status quo. They have pushed for change, and much change has been delivered, but much more change needs to be delivered. The crisis has played a large role in pushing for change over the last 2 years. But now the crisis has abated, the economy has stabilized. So the voice of the Ukrainian people, we think, will be an important part of driving the change going forward.
Thank you very much. I will move forward, but go deeper into one area, and I want to ask Oleg, we heard from the World Bank about a number of reforms in the banking sector. It's transparency, about ownership, related lending, capitalization, removing some banks from the market, and so on and so forth. So, but what is currently in the pipeline? What do you think is the crucial and immediate reforms that still needed to be done, and what we will hopefully add to the list of achievements of the National Bank or the banking sector in the next, let's say, year and a half?
Okay. if we are talking about reform which is conducted by central bank, we can distinguish between the reforms within the central bank itself. We call this transformation of central bank, and reform of the whole banking sector and the reform of the financial sector. If you are talking about transformation of central bank, we actually achieved quite a lot. I will not be humble, but I think we are probably one of the most reformist government body currently in Ukraine. Just compare, a couple of years ago we had a central bank with something like 12,000 employees. It was a huge bureaucratic organization which employed a very formalized approach, produced millions of documents, I'm not exaggerating. But this body doesn't prevent all these imbalances to accumulate into the system and ultimately to explode in huge crisis. What we achieved so far in terms of transformation of central bank, we first of all clearly defined our main functions, and our main functions to achieve price stability, then financial stability, and then to promote economic growth. We concentrated on our main core functions to achieve these functions. We get rid of almost all non-core functions which were presented within the central bank. We transferred, for example, some universities to Ministry of Education. We get rid of TV channel, printing houses, car, fleet, all this stuff. This allows us to decrease the number of staff to currently 5,500. But we didn't only lay off staff, we actually hired extensively. We hired more than 550 individuals, top talents from the banking sector, from commercial banks, from international organizations, and this allows us to greatly improve our capacity. What we are planning to do in the future for central bank, we are going to be effective, modern central bank. We are going to introduce automatization, re-engineering of the process, and further centralization. We are actually closing down all our branch network. We concentrate main functions on head office, and this would allow us to have, we have planned in 3 years to have a project which is called 6 p.m. It means we will have 1,800 employees. Just compare what we had before.
In total?
In total, yeah. Talking about banking sector itself, we concentrate on three main areas. This is first of all capitalization of the banking system, and we currently have a plan for 3-year capitalization for all banks. I think we have a very balanced approach to balance system. On one hand, we allow banks to get accustomed to very harsh economic conditions, and we allow them to somehow violate our prudential regulations, but we agree that they will be in line with our regulation within 3-year period. This is, I'm talking about not only capitalization, but also decreasing of related party loans. We understand that this is legacy. Some banks, they simply can't afford simply within 1 day to decrease related party lending to the volume which is allowed by central bank. That's why decreasing of related party lending is actually part of our capitalization plan. So, and this would be finalized in 3-year period. By year 2019, we think that our banking system would have capital adequacy ratio of 10% and all related party lending within 5% limit. Then we worked intensively on transparency of banking system, especially transparency of ownership structure. Now we know exactly all UBOs, all ultimate beneficial holders, all physical persons who are actually the owner of the banks. That's why we know who is responsible for capitalizing banking system, who are related party, and that's why in such a way we know exactly what to do in terms of related party loans. before doing this, actually, in order to understand what we have, we conducted diagnostics, which consist of asset quality review and stress test. And out of this, we actually understand the whole problem of the system. And the problem was, for example, that for some banks, related party lending account like 90% of their total assets. That's really, you know, banking system can't work in such a way.
Thank you very much. We have, I have a question for Rufat about one of the best known measures of the country's success or not success. I'm talking about doing business survey, and it's kind of, I remember even in the, before the Maidan, it was one of the targets to have improvement in doing business by any measures. But doing business is not a measure. It's not a solution by itself. It should be kind of proxy for development, for attraction of foreign investment. And the person from the IFC and the organization, the company that invests a lot globally in Ukraine also. What do you think? What should be done in order to move from improvement in the ranking to the real investments in Ukraine?
Of course, we ourselves don't look at doing business rating when we make decisions, because we know what's behind it, and then we operate anyway in the markets where we operate. For investors, this is one of the indicators, very important indicators, as you said, not the only one. But if we refer to it, the latest report, which is Doing Business 2017, prepared by IFC, ranked Ukraine 80th in the world. There was some improvement compared to the previous rating, based on the same methodology, because sometimes methodology changes, you have to compare apples to apples, so you have to sometimes go back and adjust the former rating. There was an improvement by 3 notches, so maybe there's some positive story there, nice round number, but 80 out of 189 economies. I think in the environment where we're today, we will be much higher. But we need to go beyond just the number of this number 80. In this environment, as someone already mentioned, the competition for capital in this part of the world is going to be even higher, especially post-US elections. This is one hypothesis that we will have. There may be some flight of capital back to the US and back to the developed countries. So therefore, you need to be reforming much faster. If we look at the neighboring countries, probably where the competition for Ukraine for capital is the most severe. Again, Ukraine is the 80th, Poland is 24th, we always refer to Poland, Kazakhstan is 35th, Russia is 40th, and Moldova is 44th. So clearly we need to improve beyond this. But let's go and see what's behind this rating, because it's not just about this number itself. In the past, as Dan mentioned before, the reforms have been happening. It's not like they've never been happening. But we've been bragging at IFC, including about progress made with certain regulations, like there was a lifting of the requirement to get a permit to be able to apply for seal, corporate seal. This was reported as a success. It's a very small step today. It sounds very silly. But that was a success then. But there's what's important and what's positive about the rating and what's behind it today is that on some of the areas where Ukraine was really lagging behind and which were actually very important for investors, Ukraine improved based on the most recent survey. And these are this famous access to electricity grid. There was major improvement there. Protecting minority investors, which even last year was a problem, and enforcing contracts. That doesn't mean that minority interests are always protected. That means that there's a framework already being prepared for improvements. So going forward, we should be seeing some results. Just to illustrate that this is still not fully resolved, we had a case when a borrower approached us and voluntarily offered us more security for the loan that they had. They did this to protect their assets after they learned about one of the major retail chains here, woke up one day and realized that they no longer possibly own their business because there was some change in the registration. So just to protect, they came and offered us more, hoping that we will be better protecting together, having secured it to us. So clearly there are issues with law enforcement process and all the rest of it, the court system that we all discussed, but the foundation, the regulation already showed some positive signs there. What is not so good is that Ukraine, we all know, is an economy dependent on exports. It's still a very open economy, fairly small given the world's global size, but still a very important exporter. And on the indicator as trading across the borders, there actually has been some deterioration, despite some improvements in certain areas. For example, if we look at certain measures on exports for Ukraine, again for exports, the average documentary compliance hours in Ukraine to be able to export has been 96 hours compared to 27 for the region, so the average for the region, and 3 for the OECD countries. And in terms of the costs, again for this preparation of this documentation, an average was $292 compared to $111 for the region and 36 globally. At the same time, border compliance hours, for example, in Ukraine was 26, slightly even better than for the region, 28. Still below OECD number of 12, but in OECD sometimes we don't have proper borders. So that shows that these are easy fixes. This would be easily done. It doesn't take major effort to do this, and by removing these bottlenecks, we can actually help companies to be able to export much easier, not to tie up their time and resources on these unnecessary procedures. And that would help them with their working capital requirements. It would require them less financing potentially, just from this. So whether this is an improvement or not, we still don't obviously see major FDIs flowing here, because normally in this environment, we, IFC, World Bank, EBRD, we see all these foreign investors and coming to us and getting advice, or at least ticking the box that they came and talked to us. We don't see them that often these days. Obviously, there's some other reasons beyond doing business. It's a macro stability. It is being achieved, but there is still way to go to be able to repatriate dividends, and all these issues have to be resolved. Obviously, the geopolitical issue is stopping many of them. But if we start fixing these issues, there are obviously certain types of investors, certain niches that they are still investing. They will be coming more, and we'll be seeing more of them.
That because of global uncertainty, the reforms should go faster. And here is probably partly related question, maybe a little bit more challenging, I don't know, maybe provocative, but the fact that we know that in Ukraine, in previous years, we used to have elections pretty much every year. Now we have elections in 3-year time, 2019, both presidential and parliamentary, so we still have some time before elections. But usually, the year we have 2019, the fact high politics changes before elections, some time before election. So would you agree that we are talking about probably 1 year, maybe a year and a half opportunity window that's been left for some major reforms? And if yes, what would be the probably #1 reform that you would you think we should do and can do? Daniel, can you please lead the question?
I think the #1 reform is to focus on this, obviously, doing business. And the ease of doing business is a very wide category. It involves a lot of factors, including psychological. It also includes protecting the property rights of investors. So it wraps in the whole issue of court reform and perhaps other mechanisms to try to do that. And when you talk about ease of doing business, many of the other issues start to fall away. It means that you have a less corrupt environment. It means that you don't have to go through чиновники 50 layers deep. As Yuna said, you can use e-governance. So I think this is it deals with state-owned enterprises, because you're removing the state from becoming a competitor of private business in the economy. when I hear anti-corruption, 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 it means, it starts to lose its meaning because it means so many different things to different people. I mean, fighting corruption is actually quite simple. You shine light in dark corners. And the more transparency that we can bring into the system, the more that people are dealing with computers and not civil servants, the easier it will be for everybody, and including sending your kids to Subtopics, to doing basic online shopping, to registering a company, to doing business. But I want to come back to a really important fundamental point, and obviously it's the government's job to reduce these barriers. But there has to be a stakeholder approach to doing this. And come back to a point that was made by a number of the speakers, and that is the capacity of a reform-oriented government to actually enact the huge number of diverse areas of reform. And my challenge to business associations, to investors, and to professional associations such as yourself is, don't come to the government with just a problem. Because it doesn't mean they hate you because you don't get an immediate answer. It means they may not have the capacity to actually solve the problem on their own. You have very good ministers, you have, by and large, excellent deputy ministers, you have really good directors general, but below that, everybody in government complains there's very little to work with. And that's a capacity issue, and that doesn't change overnight. So if you have an issue, and it has to be a systemic issue, not a lobbying, narrow issue, come to the government, come with your association, come with your clients, and say, okay, here's our problem, here's what we think is the solution, and here is, for example, a draft postanova of the Cabinet of Ministers that we would like to see passed, and let's have that discussion. That then becomes a concrete, actionable item that can be discussed. And I can tell you that from what I've seen in the brief time that I've been in my position, is that there is an awareness that this is a way forward, and there is a willingness to engage on this kind of basis. We have to build Team Ukraine. And if we can do it as stakeholders instead of an us and them, and I realize there are lots of people who have barriers and have bad experiences, etc. But you can complain and complain about they and them, and they're not doing this and they're not doing this. It doesn't really advance anything. We need this to be a cooperative venture. That's part of the things that I'm going to be trying to do is, in ease of doing business, is to create these dialogues. I asked some of the business associations to give me their top 5 systemic problems that need to be resolved. And I got very different answers from different business associations, and I got different understandings of what systemic means, because generally they represent the interests of their clients. And what's systemic to one client may actually be a symptom of a much larger problem. And it's the much larger problems that we have to engage and have those discussions around. And when you have those discussions about removing this complexity and that complexity and how many people do we have to talk to, you're also fighting corruption, by definition. And you're creating new institutions of governance and new institutions of decision-making that actually help the country as a whole. We need to shrink government. Actually, government has shrunken quite a bit. Decentralization has meant that a lot of the powers, now including the money, have been pushed to the local level. That may be a situation, many people argue that all we've done is decentralized corruption. But that makes it easier to battle because it's now in those communities and you're providing services to the end user in a much more effective manner. And it's up to those end users to fight back and say, this is not an effective way to use these funds. This is not an effective use. We want more transparency. We want better services, as we talked about. And you create that demand. And the more that you can generate demands that can be met in a very practical, concrete way, we can all actually move forward together.
Well, it was a very excellent answer about the willingness and capability to do it. So, but I still want to ask probably all the panelists just one thing that you should think is you should do or would like to do and probably you can do for the next maybe year and a half, you think it's possible to be done, and after that you stand up and say, I'm proud that I did at least this one thing. So for the representative of the government, the National Bank, it's probably what they're doing now. For what probably would be, what would be from your sides, like number one issue that you think should be done within, and can be done within 1 year or year and a half time period?
I honestly, maybe it will be not very popular, but I will argue about the regulation as the biggest issue of importance. The regulation is a process, because if we are doing the business rate, we are competing. So it's not about that every other country stopping doing the regulation. It's whether we are faster than the others or not. We've really made a progress, but our 80th place means that many of the other countries making bigger progress than we've done, because each time you estimate each of the countries' progress. So the regulation, we're doing the regulation for 5 years, and we've increased from around 140th place to 80th. It's a great job done for 5 years, honestly speaking. A huge job should be done, but if we're talking about these reforms slot for a year or year and a half, I think the regulation will be done even in a 2-year perspective, even in a 3-year perspective, because also from a political point of view, it's always the win story, because you're providing better services for business, you're making better services for your citizens, so you are only tackling from inside the government with your bureaucrats and some wasted interest, so it's not so hard to do. And if you will ask something that will, go to history, to some of the economical historical books, to do the reforms in the next year, I'd say 2 things. First is the land reform. If the reform that we are talking about for 25 years, postponing the moratorium and the other things, but why we are doing it? Because it was the same as yesterday's decision with the government to privatize Ukrspeed. So we were for 2 years debating whether to get them out of this list forbidden for privatization or no. And there was a big debate in the government and in the parliament, because nobody knew, and we weren't presenting how we will privatize them and how the market will work after privatization. And only when we sit together with the Ministry of Agriculture, with the State Property Fund, and draft this legislation and show the overall picture that here we start the privatization, it will be done in such a way, and the market, liberal market, will be managing in this way presented in the draft of legislation. We can then argue about the substance, but not whether to privatize or not. The same is with the land reform. There are many ways to go to sell the land, either to lease for a long period of time. But the crucial issue is that the land or the rights for the land, lease rights, should be mortgaged. We will open the banking sector to credit the agribusiness. And we are this number 3 of top exporting the agri-commodities. And why are we not getting a big capex into agribusiness? Because there are no assets still in this business. And this is a crucially important reform for this country. And we need to fix and show to all of the people how this will be doing. We should do it smart reform, not just the open and moratorium and that's all. We need to show how the land market will be running. And the second issue is the pension reform, because it will increase a lot the market, the financial market. It's the long money our economies still feel lack of, because we cannot get the long-term credits for our business to make their investments when we have no long-term resources in the financial sector. So that's why I think it's another crucial thing to start the pension reform, to start the pension insurance, to start these 2 stages of the pension reform, to get the long-term money into the economy, not only the money from the IFIs. Because if we look on Ukrainian business, there is a lack of companies that can really be the client of IFIs. It's also the reality we face. So I think, and there is a big stake of money inside the country that we can transfer from the money in our pension fund to the long money market for the long investments. So I would say that these are two things that we need to fix in a 2-year period.
Okay, thank you very much, Alek. And I will ask the three panelists, but sure, because we have a number of interesting questions and we have 20 minutes left. Please.
Yeah, we know exactly what to do. Actually, we have a plan for development of financial sector for year 2020. We think our main task here is, first of all, to reach macroeconomic stabilization, to have we are working very hardly on bringing down inflation to very low and very sustainable low inflation. That's the main task of the central bank. And this would be the foundation for economic growth, because pension reform is very important for long-term funding. But if you are talking about funding from banks, for them it's important for depositors, important to have very low inflation, which will create more economic certainty, and this would allow to have long-term money for the economy. Talking about banking sector, we should continue with bank capitalization. Definitely, we should improve efficiency of our supervision. In the end, we would like to have a sustainable, well-capitalized banking system which is poised to fund economic growth.
So do you believe that it could be done within the next 18, 24 months, you think?
Talking about inflation, bringing down inflation, we have targets this year 12%, and we are pretty much sure that we will reach this target. Next year 8%, and we will have target to reach 5% medium-term target to the year 2019.
Okay, thank you. Rafaz, number one issue that you think should and can be done?
I think if I was to choose one, I would also mention judiciary system. Building confidence of the population of the market-based judiciary system. So the system, overall the economy will start functioning differently. The banks will be confident that they can enforce on their claims on security, on their claims in general. Investors will be more obviously confident they can protect their interests. I think that's number one issue. If I was to choose one.
And what would make the World Bank happy if it's done in the next year and a half? Faruk?
Well, I would disagree with the presumption of your question that because of elections coming up, Ukraine needs to only focus on one reform. I think Ukraine cannot afford to wait 18 to 24 months to move ahead with many of the important reforms that are absolutely critical for economic progress here. But I think among the things that are most important, Ukraine needs to do something to light the fire under the engine of the economy. And one of the things that Yulia mentioned, land reform, I think it's absolutely critical. The management of land, the administration of land in Ukraine is a serious bottleneck for the private sector, not just for agriculture, but for the private sector more broadly. I think so that is one important area in which progress can be made. Some of it, this is not an important reform area. Many countries go through land reform that takes several years. But there are important places that where Ukraine can start, improving the management of state land, and then gradually opening up the markets for the sale of private land, importantly in a transparent manner. There are other important reforms for macroeconomic stability. Pension reform, I think, is absolutely critical because it's such a big threat to macroeconomic stability going forward, that unless you make some progress, or begin with some progress that leads to further progress later on, I think it will leave a very important area unaddressed. But finally, I would also mention social services, because all of these things are related. You mentioned the political cycle. People are driving the political cycle. And unless people experience tangible improvements in their quality of life, that political cycle will not deliver results that result in lasting progress for the economy. So, I think, again, I would say it's not just one thing on which progress is needed. It is multiple fronts. Of course, on any one of those fronts, you can start with first steps that will lead to further steps going forward. But I think we are economists, we are very poor political scientists, but I think the politics that usually delivers progress in any nation is the politics where politicians are able to help the population understand why these difficult reforms are absolutely critical for their own economic progress. So I think that is the type of rhetoric and the type of leadership that would really help Ukraine move forward.
Okay, thank you very much, our panelists. We don't have so much time left. I want to go from reforms, which is critical, definitely, to economic part of our panel. And I want to ask you about what is currently your major something forecast for the, let's say, next year. For example, just a few days ago, provisional real GDP for the third quarter was out. It was 1.8% versus 1.4%. Second quarter is 0, the first quarter. So would you expect this improvement and increase going forward in 2017? And will we catch up with our regional peers as the economy as a country? I would probably ask Hugo and Farouk from different sides. So what's your outlook for the economic situation growth for the next year? Overall, with the numbers, maybe, I don't know, whatever you prefer.
Just our last prognose that also was put into the budget that the real GDP will grow from 2.5 to 3%, inflation around 8.5% for the next year. There are some factors that still influence on the prognosis. First of all, it's the conflict on the east. It for sure have the great impact on the economy, and if we look back to 2015, an estimate we have around 10% of GDP decline. And around 50% by our estimation of the Ministry of Economy came from the conflict on the east. And around 1.5% came out from the Russia trade ban, because if we look on the structure of our export to 2014, beginning of 2015, Russia was the main route for exporting Ukrainian goods, and now we are switching on to the other markets. So that's why it played the negative role both with the trade ban and the transit ban. So that's why we have still a risk. A huge risk for, I think, everybody is about the commodity prices. Still, with the recent news of the US biggest oil field was discovered, we really don't understand what will be the end. I think that nobody really will take the responsibility about the prediction of the oil prices. And with the new uncertainty of the great, I would say, call it great politics, we don't know what will be the Chinese economy, and Chinese economy is driving a lot of other commodity prices, the iron ore, the steel, which is one of the crucial exports for Ukraine economy. So we are really facing a lot of unpredictability with all these factors which are outside the country. From inside the country, I think when we made our prognosis a few months ago, there was no program of IMF, but still it was no program, the prolonging with the cooperation with the IMF. And we still expect to meet all those flags and conditions that are still in our memorandum. And here I would stress that, it's when we are talking both about the investments and the both of Ukraine as the country and the relationship with our IFIs, with the other countries, it's very important to keep the promise. And it was the first time we keep the promise 3 times about the IMF. I hope we will keep, we tried, and I think we've done all from us to keep the promise, because it's about being a respectful and related partner. The government, the parliament, the national bank For the IFIs, for those international organizations, it's the same with the visa-free regime. We are a reliable partner. We meet all the issues we should have tackled in Ukraine. We've done all these 100, if I'm not mistaken, 44 points which we should have done. We made this electronic declaration that I think the most of this country were doubting that we will really do it, but we've done. So it shows that, and it all influences on the numbers, on the economy, because if you keep the promise to all of the world, so you keep the promise to your business and you keep the promise for those potential investors and the current investors. So, and another important thing that what are the key economic drivers? And those key economic drivers should be the investment and export. And we now have all the possibilities and all in our hands to make the drivers to be really put into the numbers, into the figures, into the FDIs and increasing export from our country.
Based on what Julia said, we have steel pricing going up and iron ore pricing going up, and some positive from Trump saying 1 trillion infrastructure investments, and oil price maybe will go more down if they don't agree with the PEC later in 6 months. Agriculture yields are up, so do you plan to revise the year forecast in the World Bank up for Ukraine?
We are keeping our forecasts relatively constant right now. Our forecast for next year is quite modest, around a growth of about 2%. But because of the significant global headwinds, because of the new phase of reform that Ukraine is entering. The last few years, we had reforms that were moving because the crisis and the international support that Ukraine absolutely needed, along with the demand of the people, were moving forward some very important reforms. Now, the economy has stabilized, and under these circumstances, to move with reforms at the same pace as was happening during the crisis is not so easy, is what the international experience shows. But I think forecasts for just the next year are less meaningful than our assessment of economic prospects in the medium term. Our assessment is that the reforms actually move. If some of the very big ticket reforms are addressed, the economic prospects in Ukraine have significant upside, that the growth rate could rise to 3 to 5% and perhaps even more in the medium term. And as Salka mentioned in her opening remarks, given where Ukraine is today compared to several other countries with similar levels of resources, with similar levels of capacity and human capital of the population, there is a lot of upside on growth prospects. And I think the reforms of the last 2 years are beginning to make a difference. We are, if we look at the anecdotal evidence, there is a new Ukraine that is emerging. Of course, there is the old industrial base, and that's commodity based and so forth. But if you look at the new enterprises that are emerging, you see in supermarkets Ukrainian cheese that is now competing with imported cheese. It is quite good quality. I spoke last weekend to someone who was working for an IT company, where they're basically hiring programmers from all over Ukraine, from Dnipro, Kharkiv, Vinnytsia, Lviv, all over Ukraine. They're putting them all in one office in Kiev. And these people are not all working on the same project for some firm overseas. They're all subcontracted to different firms in London or in Silicon Valley or in different parts of the world. They're all working on different projects, sitting in one office. It's a pretty innovative concept. So I think there's a lot happening underneath that the new circumstances are enabling. And I think if the right conditions are created, the upside is really very considerable here.
Okay, thank you very much. And you touch on a very important issue because macro is based on micro, and usual investors do not invest in macro itself, they invest in some particular companies and industries. So I want to ask Rufat, based on your huge local, regional, and global experience, what do you think would be the industries that would benefit in the medium term, let's say like that, compared, we heard some commodities or some sophisticated production. What do you think, and where should we or investors invest in Ukraine?
I think the easy answer would be to say agribusiness. That's obvious. It has been attention for IFC, for IFIs, for investors, for banks. But what we want to say obviously is IT, we want to say high technology, high value-added products. But let's maybe take a step back and look at Ukraine, because there's some fundamental things like competitive advantages which are there and we cannot escape them. You know, Ukraine is #1 in the world in terms of crude iron ore reserves, 20% of the world's reserves, 3rd in the iron ore content. This has not gone anywhere, fortunately. Ukraine still has it. 7th in the world again in terms of the proven coal deposits. Again, 4% of the global resources. We talked about the black soil, from 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's black soil is here. 70% of the country is black soil, so it's obvious agribusiness is important, but then you want to go further and do more value-added products there, but you have to tap into markets. Russia being close, trying to access penetrate more the Middle Eastern markets, and then obviously going into the more profitable but much more competitive European markets. This is a challenge, but this is obviously an opportunity. But these industries that we have, based on those resources, are going to be driving investors into that, whether we want it or not. And I don't think we should be shy about it, because it's okay to be focusing on your core competences. You know, we can try to diversify to the extent we can. It's always a good thing to do. But the reality is that it doesn't work easily, at least. Many countries try to diversify their economies away from 1, 2, 3 areas of specialization, sometimes linked to commodities, and they failed. Well, they achieved some marginal improvements. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do this. But the reality is that the money will flow into those important sectors. Again, when you see that the markets are improving for hard commodities, it's affecting Ukraine. It hasn't affected Ukraine this week, because there have been obviously other factors depressing the market, but I think this is going to have an effect, obviously. So we should be capitalizing on that and just create the conditions so that when these industries, based on those commodities, they evolve, the resources are properly allocated in the broader economy, because Ukraine, not only being rich in commodities, but also having gone through the forced industrialization of the Soviet times, as industry is an important part of the economy. In 37% of GDP was the industry in 2007. Obviously today it's less, about 25%. We have all these challenges with the loss of markets, trying to rediscover new markets, come up with new markets, new products, and this is where FDI is going to be very important. But again, we talked about the investment climate, which is quite important. Again, I'm going to just illustrate on an even more micro level. One our client came and approached us 2 years ago, thinking to set up an operation in Ukraine. I'm not going to go into details. I was surprised when they mentioned this, but they laid out all the justifications: low labor cost, less than in China, proximity to Europe, the CFTA, much quicker delivery time, and they being able to respond quickly to customer needs. Skilled labor force, but in the end they went to Latvia. I don't know if they built a plant there. Obviously there's other plants that have been declared and are being built in Ukraine. This is what we need, and hopefully that will lead into more higher value-added products. Obviously we, as an IFI, will be following these and trying to support them, but it's not only us, obviously. We're not going to be sufficient in terms of the providers of funding, including capacity. And not that we will necessarily invest in coal ourselves, we don't do that. It's not the sector of our focus normally, given the environmental issues often. Not that we will necessarily invest in steel, but others will. So these are obviously areas that would be, I think, doing well, provided the external environment is favorable. But we'll be focusing, because we have also a mandate, on obviously on agribusiness, on trying to open new markets for the agricultural companies, trying to help the companies to move up the value chain, which they are doing, but we will be helping with that, opening new markets, helping companies to create specifications that are acceptable in the Western markets included, like MHP was the first client that managed to, without help, start exporting to the EU markets when it comes to poultry, the first from Ukraine. The companies that are entering the Middle Eastern markets for the first time, and hopefully China, which is competitive, but still that can absorb really huge amount of European exports.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I have a few other questions, but I don't have time, and I want to open the floor for Q&A, for your questions. We have very respectful panelists here, and I'm sure you have a few questions. If not, I have a few other questions, so please go ahead. I think we should have a microphone there. Please raise your hand, and yeah, please. Please name yourself and address the question to anyone or some particular panelist.
Well, my name is Petro. I have a question to Yulia and to Dan. Yulia being, from the ministry and you from the investment office. Can you give one reason why you believe you cannot talk today about, successful examples of privatization?
Thank you. Why you cannot talk about successful privatization, correct? Examples.
To be honest, there are, for the last year, no examples of the big privatization. So there was a try of OPP over the $500 million US, but nobody came. And I think it was a lesson for state property fund. And as most of the advisors and I advised were talking about that the price was too high at the time, taking into account the shape, the market, and all of the other issues that still this OPP has. So that was the lesson. Now we expect in the middle of December the second, I would say it's not the second attempt, it was 20 years we're trying to privatize Odessa fertilizer plant. I would say one thing, that the country that have 1,700 state-owned companies, including hotels, including sport clubs and other strategic objects in the list of forbidden for privatization in the law is failed to have successful privatization. Look on this list of SOEs which our predecessors in the government put there in the list that are of the strategic importance for the country that are forbidden for privatization. It's ridiculous. If to treat it as the strategical approach of the country of these SOEs, we will be looked from the outside, I would say very diplomatically, quite strange. And I here agree with Daniel that said that we need to change the mind. Our state-owned companies are not the prize, and there is not a list of any princes to take those prizes. And the example of OPP was really very, teaching for us. It was a lesson for us that it's not a pride. It's the huge number of problems that ASEAN have, and we need to treat them from the business perspective. If it's not a cash cow, if it's making losses, if there is a not clear legal opinion, and I think I came from the business, it's very risky transaction at the time. So to expect a very high price and a risky transaction in the still the risky economy with no reformed judicial system, it all influences the price. So I would say that the biggest problem is the mentality of, especially of a huge number of members of parliament, that this really small piece of real estate are really strategic objects for their economy. So I think that's the main thing in the mind.
Yeah, very briefly, I agree with that. Coming back to who's the bride, and OPZ is probably, my personal view, is probably not the best example of not the best asset with which to start. First of all, I agree with Yulia, we have an impressive number of state-owned enterprises, but the real value to a foreign investor, there's very few of them. If you really wanted to start with a signature privatization that really had value and do the process, which actually is even more important at this stage than actually the result or how much money it's going to generate, I would have started with Turbo Atom, for example. But nobody asked me. I think that OPZ is going to be a difficult issue because of the Firtash debt. And from what I've heard from foreign investors, they're going to say, you can put this, you can lower the price even more by another half of the amount you're being asked for. But until the government does something to deal with that outstanding debt, this asset for us is difficult. Having said that, there are people that are interested. Once again, coming back to the mentality, what is the actual policy behind putting up OPZ? What is the actual, who is actually going to end up with this asset? There are rumors that a number of the so-called oligarchs are in line to be the primary bidders. And frankly, from a foreign investment perspective, it's going to be really difficult to if this asset falls into those hands, to say that this is a process that should have taken place. I think it's more important, even if you have good assets that aren't worth much, but somebody might want to buy them, let the market decide, put them up. Start with the smaller privatizations, but get the process right. Hire independent companies to run it. Do it transparently. Make it really a signature, and that changes the mentality and the approach, and it changes the narrative about Ukraine as a place to do business.
Yeah, maybe it's small adding to what Yulia said. Anecdotal, a year and a half ago, I think, Dragon helped Minister of Economy to analyze state companies. And one of the biggest issues we have how to analyze, it was called, I think, horse breeding plant, Plymennoy Zavod, and then we said why it was state-owned, but anyway, so there are a number of plants, companies, state-owned, that it's totally not clear why they're strategic and what should be done with that. I think we can take maybe one, maybe two more questions maximum. Yeah, please, there, gentlemen.
Good morning, my name is Andriy Even. I'm from the Netherlands. We have been investing in glass houses in Georgia and Ukraine. We started in 2011 in Ukraine, and since 2014 I'm living in Georgia with my family. Georgia is an absolute paradise for investors in terms of transparency, doing business, securing your rights. I've been very positive by the move of the government to, after the last election, to also get some know-how from Georgia involved. But over time I've seen it, my basic question is, could we expect something close to the Georgian transparency in doing business here in Ukraine over the coming 2 to 4 years? I mean, it's very hopeful to see that it is possible in a country which has such similarities to Ukraine. So I hope you could offer that perspective to me as well as an investor.
Probably briefly, whom do you address your question?
Well, yeah, I was thinking about it before standing up. I'm not sure. I leave it up to you as a moderator who would be the right person to answer the question.
Well, you talked about investment paradise, so probably talking about its investments, and I'll probably ask Daniel, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that I think that Georgia is an excellent example for Ukraine in many respects. But I think that one of the preconditions that Georgia actually showed was that when you have a wave of reformers who come in, who control the parliament, who control the presidency, who control the government, and you have the political will, you can do an awful lot. Here, let's be charitable and call it, we have much more political diversity and pluralism than they do in Georgia. And I think that the tensions in Georgia came from within the party, and then they split into two. And there was some backsliding, actually. But the underlying institutions that they were able to build survived. I think that's a lesson for us in terms of, again, the process. My own view is that the process that's taking place here is the natural one. It's happening. The reforms are taking place. We need to move forward faster, et cetera, et cetera. But even if we had those preconditions, some of the reforms that we discussed today, land, pension, courts, et cetera, take years. It doesn't happen overnight. And there are complicated social issues too. We have socioeconomic issues. There has to be more consultation with the people about what the implications of these changes are. There are large parts of the country that still have a mentality rooted in the past. They all want to live better, but they have very different views about what that means. And that process has to be managed. So I think that there are a lot of the policies that the Georgian government implemented since 2003 are very good models for Ukraine. We've adopted some of them. You see a new police force, etc. But we have a political dynamic that it's not a trajectory; it's a spiral, and so it's moving upwards, but it changes speed when it does at different points.
Thank you.
Three more points about the Georgia, because I was honored to spend hours talking to Kaha Benakidze, who was one of the leaders of Georgian reforms, and we talked about much about the reforms that he started in Georgia, and there are three things that I think we should also take into account. And one thing is already Daniel mentioned about the unity, political unity, because the more different you have in the parliament, the less you have support, and the more you need the time for these discussions, because it's still the democracy. And I think it's one of the values we'll still have, even if it's too long, it takes time to adopt the laws, even you have more debate, but still we have this democracy and the basis. Another thing is the scale, because Ukraine is much more bigger, and it's also influence about this diversity in politics, in society. And what is second thing is where we are studying. For example, we talked with Kaha 3 years ago about the increase of tariffs, the utility tariffs, which was at that time very needed reform, but nobody was, in Ukraine even ready to discuss it. And I was asking him how he did it in Georgia for 5 times, and he said, there was no electricity in the evening, Tbilisi, and there was a choice for people to pay the 5 times more bill and to get this electricity 24 hours, 7 days a week, or not to pay and have it for hours. And the problem we have in Ukraine, that people believe that it's something taken from the God. It's like the socialism, it's a free of charge and it's taken somewhere from the sky. So there was this kind of change from the start. And the third thing that we really are lacking of, the Georgians were very successful also in communicating what they have done. They've done this success story also in PR and communication. And we already done a lot of things. But we really have a big gap of communicating what we have already done. So we should also, I think it's from the government, from the communication point of view. It's also the communication outside the country. Because if you look at the titles of Ukraine, what are the titles? War and corruption. And nobody is talking about the really success stories. We have a big companies coming, we have the Cargill announcement, Fujikura, Leone's second stage of the investment. We should also create our own, a fairy tale of Ukraine, because still there is a lot of things that already have been done for these last 2 years. But we need to unite and to tell about the successes, but not to criticize each other.
Thank you very much. I have just really small remarks as a summary. Three small issues. First of all, as we discussed, a number of issues that we're dealing with are much more than we had in the poll, and our panelists discussed that. The second issue is that we started at the FDI, foreign direct investment, a kind of as a result of the reforms. But we discussed here also important issue that can be a national security issue, and it's mandatory to have a first development for the country. And the third one would be that we had really great panelists, and I want to thank them. Please applause for being here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andriy. Thank you, panelists. We will have shortly a coffee break, so the audience will still have opportunity, I hope, to ask additional questions. Indeed, there were many top reform areas touched during this discussion, but still I think that all panelists at the beginning have consistently agreed on the key reform which will be driving the rapid economic growth of the country, and that's all about, quote by Danilo Bilak, shining light in dark corners. So let's see now how and if you have changed your opinion after this fast panel, and let's vote. Let's answer the questions which we suggested to you at the beginning of the panel again. So the question is, what do you believe will be the key driver of economic growth in Ukraine? A favorable export commodity markets, B, recovered confidence in the banking system and resume lending, C, combating corruption and fair court system, and D, foreign direct investments. So not a significant change, but definitely Yulia and Dan have done a great job in convincing that we need direct investments to stimulate the economic growth in Ukraine. Thank you all. We now have roughly 20 minutes coffee break because we are a bit behind the schedule, so we would welcome all of you here in 20 minutes at 11:30 we start the second panel. Thank you.